And I'm going to press it in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the SAP Developers YouTube channel, celebrating today something special, but maybe we'll come to that later. This is a special episode with some even more special guests. And I'm sure if you've joined this stream already, you know what this is all about. We're going to talk about ABAP. We're going to talk about ABAP's past, its present, and also, if we get a chance, its future. I'm hoping we're going to cover all those different angles. I'm DJ. I'm a developer advocate, and I'm joined by a couple of colleagues, Tom and Rich, but also a couple of super special guests, Boris Gebhardt and Karl Kessler. I don't think these four folks need any further introduction, but I'm going to make them introduce themselves anyway, and I'm going to point the finger at Tom first. So Tom, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I work in the developer advocates team as well, and our team overall does a lot of stuff like this, developer outreach and communication, education, and then advocating for you, the developer, back into SAP. Longtime ABAP developer, but career's also taken me in different paths over the years into HANA development and cloud native development and stuff like that.
Thanks, Tom. How about Rich?
Hi, everybody. Rich Heilman, developer advocate on the same team as Tom and DJ. My background is in ABAP, very similar to Tom. Background in ABAP, and then also working in HANA development for a number of years. Now I'm focusing back on ABAP as a developer advocate.
And Karl.
Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Karl Kessler, and I work for SAP for now 30 years. So I've been around for quite some time. Started in the ABAP development team at that time, but as a product manager, and have covered several roles in my SAP career. I also joined at a certain point in time the Java camp, but then regretted and came back to the ABAP scenery. So great times to be back in ABAP again, and happy to join this call.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Boris Gebhardt.
Pleasure for me. So Boris, Chief Product Owner of the ABAP platform. So hopefully I can handle at least the present and future topics of ABAP. Perhaps you know me from some tickets about troubleshooting ABAP, all these debugger sessions and so on, or the jam sessions where we succeed with ABAP sometimes. And now I'm really interested in seeing all the questions about the history, present, and future stuff concerning ABAP.
Perfect. Thanks, thanks, folks. So just a quick word as to how we're going to do this. It's going to be as relaxed as possible. You know, we're not going to share any screens or anything. There's certainly no slides. Rich has a number of questions that we internally have gathered, but also gathered from you folks over the past week or two. But also, I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you've got any thoughts or any questions, stick them in the chat. I may notice them, I may not notice them. If we don't cover them, it's my fault, not yours or not any of these other four folks. So yeah, let us know what you think, but we're going to let Rich sort of drive this with the questions that we've gathered. And yeah, let's see where it goes. We're going to do it up to an hour, no more than an hour. We may finish early, we may use the whole hour. So yeah, over to you, Rich.
All right, so thanks. So, you know, I think a lot of people want to get into the history, so let's just start there. So can you guys give us some idea about the early beginnings of the ABAP language, you know, how it got started, who had the grand idea of creating this wonderful language that thousands and thousands of developers are using today?
Absolutely, Rich. And I must admit, I have prepared a little bit for that particular question because I thought it would come up.
Yeah.
And actually, based on a little bit of the research, I got this little brochure here, which is actually a description of the R1 system.
Oh, wow.
So it's at that time it was called the RF and RM module, so to speak, or RFM. R1 was not an official brand at that time, of course. And the brochure is actually from 1976. And just to give you a little bit of an idea here, in 1976, SAP consisted of 30 employees, 30 employees managing 50 customers. Now, and the fine thing is, if you read that through, I got this from my father, who was a very early SAP adopter. So he was one of the first 50 customers with L'Oreal Hair Cosmetics. And if you read that through, you find a lot of the properties of today's infrastructure was already present in this very early R1 version, if you will. And believe it or not, I pulled out a little page here that shows you that the term ABAP was already present. That means this ABAP idea, I'm not familiar with that system, but the idea of an ABAP, that means the generation of a report based on all of the document data which is inside the system, doing nice formatting, list screens, selection screens, all that kind of stuff, was basically present in the initial SAP offering, so to speak. But let's be honest, it was not at the time, was not a programming language environment with an editor and debugger and whatever you could imagine. It was basically it was a collection of macros. And there was no minor colleague than Klaus Tschira, rest in peace, who had this idea to build a reporting inside the system. So SAP was very strong in transactional consistency, the idea of doing financials and doing a consolidation between the different accounts, making sure that there's always the financial equation if you do the balance sheet and all that stuff. And therefore, I think it was a really great idea of Klaus Tschira at that point in time to think of a reporting tool. Now, but let's be honest, the ABAP that I first experienced was the ABAP on R2. So that was basically my starting point at SAP. And this ABAP was basically already, that was in the 80s. And this ABAP engine basically was very powerful at that point in time. It also started a little bit with reporting. Yeah, so you remember this famous top of page, start of selection.
Top of page, end of page, start of selection, page. End of selection, get KNA1, get MAR A, get MAR B.
So DJ can tell you a lot of stories about that one. I'm pretty sure, and he's much deeper in the practice there. And DJ, please jump in if I do something wrong here. But actually, that was also a little bit of a competition between SAP and Software AG. You might remember that the famous Software AG was a little bit older than SAP, so a couple of years older. They had this famous ADABAS database system and Natural, a 4GL environment. And there was always a little bit of a competition between the SAP folks and the Software AG folks, because Software AG was bigger at that point in time, and they were a little bit leading the German software engineering scene. But the ABAP guys were also very, very agile. And essentially, ABAP was the R2 ABAP was basically invented by one person. Yeah, so that was Gerd Rodet at that point in time. And over time, he then basically elaborated on this ABAP engine, on this ABAP processor. But all of the interesting topics, for example, a data dictionary or a screen painter. It was not a painter. It was basically an alphanumeric screen. These famous transaction codes that you might remember, they stem from this R2 system. And I think what I liked most, basically, when I started with R2 ABAP was the strong debugging environment. You could debug any ABAP code. That was fantastic with this famous /h OK code. And the second thing I've not experienced in other environments was basically the handling of the internal tables. I think that was really outstanding. There was no other language, 4GL language environment that really gave you this kind of freedom to process large amount of internal table data and then put it to the screen on a list or into Spool or wherever you go. And from then on, I think the success of ABAP was paramount. And in R2, I don't want to go in all of those details, but in R2, I think we had roughly a coverage of 50% of ABAP coding inside the system. The other 50%, and DJ, you can give us some insight here as well, that consisted of assembly code. So that was really macro assembler, and I've never touched the macro assembler, so I was lucky to start with ABAP right away, and it was a great experience at this inflection point going from R2 to R3.
In fact, there was an inflection point going from assembler at customer sites, as I was working at a customer at the time in the 80s. So I was writing or mostly modifying existing assembler programs, batch programs, and TP programs as well. But when ABAP first arrived on the scene for us, this was with R2 4.1D. It was this report writing language. Really all we had was the ability to ride on the back of another database read program, which was written in assembler, and you say, oh, when this segment comes up, add this, collect this, append this, and then print some stuff out. And you wrote that all in the job control language itself as a sort of configuration. ABAP was just configuration then. By the way, that's also where my Q macro name comes from. It was there was such thing as a Q macro in the SAP R2 assembler.
Excellent. And I think it's really a pity. I hope we can fix this with our 50th anniversary. But it's really a pity if you go to the internet and look out for resources on R2 or in RFM, R1, if you will. There's nothing out there. It's really zero. So I try to research here and there. It's horrible. You don't find anything. Apparently, SAP starts with R3. I mean, it was also the start of the World Wide Web at that point in time. But it's really a pity that this kind of information is not tangible any longer. We should post it again.
Talking of that, just before I saw something already. There's lots of things in the chat, but I'm going to leave them for now because let you folks talk. But a number of requests, first from Christian, but also from me. Can we get a copy of that stuff that's in front of you, Karl?
Yeah, and I need to double check whether there's, the famous copyright stuff. But I'm happy to share this, and I think it's really worth reading because you also understand the kind of the evolution of the system. For example, the famous create a second mode with a /o and /i that was already present at this very early stage. That means running transactions in parallel, basically, and also the scope of the application itself was interesting because they had financials from the very beginning. They had materials management and invoice verification, but no sales, funny enough. So they started really with a very small nucleus, added more modules, etc. And then when they saw, oh, there's customer demand, then they started, okay, now let's also cover the sales and distribution side of the house and augment the system. I think that was a little bit the philosophy of the early SAP success. Listen to what customers need. Don't write the whole system in one step, a big monolith, and then wait until customers come, but rather do it in an incremental, customer-driven fashion very early on.
Wow,
perfect.
You make a really good point about you were talking about the interactive debugger, and some of our younger viewers may not realize just how important that was, or how revolutionary that was, right? Because every environment has that now. We kind of take it for granted, these things that just work. But Karl or DJ, what was the debugging like pre-ABAP? I mean, I remember like printing out reams of paper, going through it by hand, and that was debugging, in the old days. Not even an interactive display or anything.
There was actually there was a way that you could, from the transaction screen, open up the so-called ZCSA. This was in R2, the Z Common System Area, and what you got was basically a hex display. So you had all the hex codes. Of course, it was EBCDIC rather than ASCII, being IBM mainframe based. But on the right-hand side, you had the sort of the character representation, and you could go into main memory or go specifically into the task handler and change memory and debug like that. You were debugging literally by changing hex values. That was the pre-ABAP debugging days with SAP R2, and I really enjoyed it. It was super scary, but it was amazing. But it was nothing compared to the interactive debugger we got with ABAP almost from the get-go.
Yeah, but if you compare that to like competing environments at the same time, doing CICS development or something like that, there was nothing like that in the rest of the industry.
Exactly. And I mean, Boris can tell us how tough it was to introduce this two-process debugger, I guess, Boris.
So perhaps the first step was that we at SAP were even able to debug on customer side in all the system in productive environments. I think that was one of the big points or the big things which were important to troubleshoot more or less very quickly issues without disturbing anyone in the system. So that was really the big one. Yes. As I started, then the two-process debugger more or less was one of the big topics. As always, if you introduce something in ABAP, it's always hard to convince the people that this is really necessary and that we should do that step and not incrementally improve the stuff which we have already. But that was one of the really big inventions which we had. But to be honest, it took about 5 to 10 years to convince the complete ABAP community that this is now the new debugger. And new is really old if you see 10 years.
Yeah.
So 5 to 10 years is a normal cycle, which we see, to be honest. The same is for ABAP objects, or if we go now for the Eclipse IDE and so on, it's always, we must always keep pushing to get new stuff into the community.
Wow, that was a lot of information already on the first question. That was great. Let's hit on a couple rapid fire questions here. Maybe they're shorter answers, but I during your talk earlier, Karl, you mentioned natural, one of the language that was inspired by ABAP. Is there any other languages that inspired and helped shape the ABAP language?
I think yes. I mean, like natural, ABAP initially had this keyword syntax, where you always start with a keyword and then you have a lot of additions and parameters, etc., and the famous dot at the end. And so the influence that basically stem from COBOL. Yeah? So COBOL has also this keyword-oriented syntax with the data statements, etc. Move corresponding, add corresponding. These have exact counterparts in the COBOL language. But I think the approach, the idea was really to have something self-standing, not to be too close to a particular language design. And of course, when we introduced, and one of the big important innovations was certainly introduction of SQL. So the direct embedding of SQL with internal tables into the ABAP core, into the ABAP engine, that was of paramount importance, absolutely. So what we sometimes call the SAP SQL. Mm-hmm. And the SAP SQL worked on a large bunch of different databases, not just relational databases, but also this in the R2 times, also on this famous vSAM files from IBM. Yes. All these old-fashioned dinosaurs.
Used to use this program, this patch program, to create the index cluster, the ITCAMs, remember?
Yes.
vSAM delete define clusters.
Exactly, and many of the, for example, also transaction control, the famous enqueue operation that came from vSAM. Yeah, a vSAM enqueue means you lock this particular record inside the database, and then certainly efficiency. But the other languages that had a strong influence conceptually, especially when we introduced the object orientation, that was certainly Java. Java was around, but not only Java. It was also a little bit of Visual Basic. Some guys might now argue, oh, okay, Karl, stop it. That's probably not the right level of discussion. But we always look for ways, okay, how to adapt certain innovations, take them in a pragmatic approach, incorporate them into the language without disrupting the language completely. And the criticism that you hear and there, you find something against the keyword-oriented syntax, and there's not a semicolon behind the statement. We had even a project, a very, very substantial project where we tried to change the syntax. Yeah, so that was a very serious examination of the ABAP code. What would it take to transform the syntax in a more C-like or Visual Basic-like syntax? And there was a thorough analysis being done. But in the end, we did not do that because it would have caused a lot of disruption at customer side. Yeah, if you make it really seriously, then you basically also force the customers for post-processing after the upgrade. That means they had also to adapt their ABAP code to the new syntax, etc. And then we thought this is probably quite critical, and we stopped there. We did not pursue this project any longer. So conceptually, I think a lot of influences along the way, no question. Syntactically, we stayed, but I must also say that in today's time with expression syntax, etc., sometimes I look at ABAP code and I think it looks like Lisp actually with many parentheses. But very strong operators, by far not this move and add and if and while, but really compact code. Now that's the idea, to push whatever makes sense into a large, powerful statement, doing a lot of conversions in between here and there. I think that was the strength, and certainly, yeah, some syntactical sugaring, not as you would expect it from other languages, but it was never a hurdle. It was never a hurdle to adopt innovation, I would say.
You know,
go for it, Tom.
Just real quick, one of the things I've noticed recently, and putting in a historic context, you mentioned like all the COBOL syntax from the early days, but I see a lot of influences from C as well, with the way heap and stack and memory are handled, and some of the behind the scenes things. It was like the COBOL syntax, but then C handling underneath it. And I've really noticed that recently. I've been learning Rust, which is just like a modern update to C, C++, and all these concepts of how you handle stack and heap and header lines and things like that. It feels exactly, I mean, it took me right back to my roots of ABAP, actually. So you really see that influence of C behind the scenes as well.
Absolutely.
Perhaps because the kernel is built in C, so the developer.
Some of the best parts come through there, right?
Yeah. And concerning the number of statements, perhaps it helps to know that new statements are really hard because they may collide with the names of macros. Therefore, if we want to add a new statement, then we must reuse an existing one. So fortunately, we have many generic statements like create, delete, update, and can add additions. But totally new statements would be hard today, because the name of macros of customers would collide with those, and this would make it incompatible. Therefore, no fear, there won't be too many new statements in the future just because of the compatibility which we have to ensure.
I mean, that statement alone just makes me really realize how much of an amazingly difficult job it must have been, or it still is, to curate this language that's been around since, well, since the early 80s at least. And, it's still being worked on now. I mean, in fact, I want to bring in a question. There's so many questions and comments. It's fantastic to see in the chat. And I'm sorry we won't be able to get to them all. But one particular one that I think resonates with me, at least, is, as Lawrence S. has said, how do you look at the younger generation who is not learning ABAP anymore? Youngsters leaving school are more low coding and doing front-end service stuff. What's your general thoughts on, your opinion, your feeling on that? I mean, we're still developing ABAP, and ABAP has definitely has got a future. So how does that tie with the younger generation?
So,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, perhaps I start, Karl, and then you go on. We often hear that fear, but as an example, we hired a lot of new people in our department, young people. And here we didn't have a big issue, to be honest, to convince them to join the ABAP platform, to join ABAP development in the ABAP platform. I think you can't compare the ABAP what we had some decades ago and now. You can more or less, it has the same structures and IDE and stuff which you have in other languages as well. And additionally, you must keep in mind what kind of impact you have if you do ABAP coding, what kind of customers you can serve, and so on. So the impact you have as an ABAP developer is, from my perspective, really phenomenal, and that hasn't changed during the years. And therefore, I think we don't have issues to find young people to do the ABAP development as for our company, as an example. Mm-hmm. And that's what we have to ensure, that we keep the level more or less up, to ensure that we keep that all the new stuff which is coming up in other languages, that all that is fed into our investment as well, so that more or less the developers which are coming from university more or less are not afraid if they see what they have to do if they start their first ABAP projects.
Yep. Great answer. Thanks. Rich, do you want to grab another one from the bag?
Yeah. So I have a couple more here. So what does ABAP stand for, the acronym itself? I'm not going to try to read what's on here because my German is very rusty. I had 4 years in high school, but I'm not even going to attempt that. But rough translation being maybe general report preparation processor. So what did the letters ABAP actually stand for?
Well, very often in SAP terms, we redefine what was defined earlier to adjust to market needs. And in this famous brochure that I showed you earlier, it talks about Allgemeines Beleg-Auswertungsprogramm. That means a general program to evaluate SAP documents, to aggregate SAP document values and fields. That's very close, I would say. And then we changed it to Berichtsaufbereitungsprozessor, or now it's the English term is Advanced Business Application Programming Language. I think it's an artwork. It's an artwork, a word like DynPro, the dynamic program, which was also a great means of abstraction, a great means to design a screen, but not only the screen with the fields. The important thing of the DynPro was also there's logic attached to it. There's a behavior. Today we would say it's an ABAP behavior attached to it that controls how this screen, how this UI element, Fiori element would work with the end user, and what would be the reaction on the backend side. And therefore, I think ABAP is a word on its own. But yes, we have this genealogy, and we should add it to the dictionary. Yeah.
Well, keeping with the name topic here, what about when ABAP/4 was added and then it was taken away at some point as well? What was that all about?
There we have a nice anecdote, because when we started the object orientation, there was big discussion. Yeah? And let's be honest, the founder of ABAP, the inventor of ABAP in R2, was he certainly drove this project, but he was not 100% convinced in the beginning that object orientation would solve SAP's problems. Yeah? And he was a very technically innovative guy, and he said, okay, we have a lot of problems to solve, and I'm not sure whether object orientation is the one and only solution to that. But of course, when it was accepted that we need to have objects, and there were also good reasons, because we wanted to beautify our screens, we wanted to add controls to the processes, UI controls and all that stuff, which very well resonate with object orientation. It was clear we need to rename this ABAP 4, and ABAP 4, I mean, that stands for the 4th generation language, and ABAP, after this dramatic success of R3, it was certainly bigger than 4GL environment. And then we had tons of different competing names. I think it was OO ABAP and ABAP OO and whatever. And then in the end, Hasso Plattner stood up and said, it's now ABAP objects, period. And from then on, the 4 got basically dropped.
Wow. Okay. So I think all 214 people watching, and the 5 of us, I think we know SC38 and SC80 like the back of our hands. I mean, we live in these transaction codes. Any story behind where the 38 or the 80 or came from?
Well, also a story. I mean, it was basically the transaction code from R2, the SE38, and I mean, DJ remembers that I think we had only 4 characters for a program name at that point in time.
That's so right.
There is not too much flexibility left, And if you already have an SE or TM, was it in R2, then you have basically 2 digits that you can vary. That's basically it.
I mean, the 38 came from the fact that the program that contained the code for that area was SAP PD38, right?
Exactly.
And so in R2, the related transaction was TM38, and then it became SE38 when we moved to R3. But everything was driven by the 4 like you say, the 4 character program names, not only the batch program names, F120 or F110, 110 was the original payment program that ran in batch in R2, and then F120 was the modern version that came out in the late 80s. And then we have, M04M for, MM or RM at the time. So all these different things are all based around the 4-character sort of mentality, the nice, clean, neat way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. So a little bit more on the history. So I think this one actually came from Mr. Young himself. So I'm just going to read this. This is a good one. So history of the dialog work process model, right? So he's heard rumors before that it was invented in a single weekend after a demo failed. Is that true? Any backstory to that?
Boris, did you talk to Harald on that one?
No, I haven't.
I think we can't answer that one. The
Okay.
only thing that I can remember, because I know Harald Cook for quite a long time, was our boss and drives the ABAP unit.
You're still the boss.
He's still sorry. Oh my gosh, sorry for that one.
Have you got another announcement for us?
Continues to be. Oh. Can we please rewind a little bit? But one thing was that this is directly attached to Harald. I think you won't punish me if I tell this right now. In the beginning, when we went from R2 to R3, we tried to get rid of this famous role storage. That means we have now a Unix environment, we have Unix processes, we can scale up like crazy. Do we still need to do this context switch? Roll in, roll out, that type of thing. And then in the initial project, R3 was basically built as a single process. That means the DIN processor, the ABAP processor, the database interface would run as its own process, and SubGUI or SubTemo terminal emulator would connect to such a work process, and we can have as many as we would like. But then it turned out very quickly, oh no, we need to better do resource management. So it does not, the system does not scale. It scales with a couple of users, but it does not scale with hundreds or even thousands of users. And then basically there was the need to introduce the dispatcher, which plays the role of a DC system in the mainframe context. And Harald was the one who crafted and designed this dispatcher program, dispatcher process. And when he introduced it, he did basically a fork. So very early in the startup phase of a work process, he simply forks off the other dialog and batch work processes. And guess what? After the fork, you cannot reach those statements with the traditional debuggers at that time. That means with one little statement, fork, he could basically disable the whole C debugging with one statement. And that was horrible in the beginning, because all of a sudden the guys had to do again write-outs and printfs and what have you. But it was solved soon thereafter, because you could then basically attach to a running program that was these attaching debuggers at that point in time. But in the beginning, it was really, it was a major roadblock for testability, of course.
In fact, the thinking about the work process, I always think of it as a 3-layer cake. You've got the DINP, the DINPro processor, the task handler, and the ABAP part of the stack. And it just reminds me of something else you said, Karl, just before, thinking about the DINPros. And again, just going back to ABAP on R2 and just generally DINPros on R2. We got to remember that the terminals and the terminal protocol at the time, the 3270, was not like a serial terminals that we know from Unix. It was a screen by screen thing. So you got a whole screen. You could interact with it without any communication with the mainframe, and then you sent it back. And I think that design has informed, or did inform, the whole DINPro design, and that's why we think about DINPros in terms of a load of stuff, and then you have the process before output and the process after input, and that all comes originally from that sort of terminal protocol.
Exactly, this transaction control. And it also made sure that transactions are short in nature, especially when you do dialog processing. It's bounded. You execute the PAI and the PPO, and then comes the next screen, and the transaction is over. And that really was an important means to enable this scalability once again. And today we see it also in the basically in all kind of scalability challenges, that you need to properly design the resource consumption on whatever level it makes sense. Yeah, sometimes might be a little bit outruled or a little bit historic in nature, but it's really interesting to see that this transaction control, transaction monitoring, or ULTP, if you like, still was a very important precondition or prerequisite for this initial success with R3. Yeah, because when I joined the company, everybody said R2 is saving our salaries, and nobody knows whether R3 will ever be successful. And that was a serious discussion. Yeah, of course we will add some R3 customers here and there, maybe mid-sized customers, but the big guys, the DAX and stocks, etc., they will run on mainframe. They will continue to run on mainframe. And I think adding this level of resource consumption of transaction control was a big requirement to scale.
Great.
I'm curious though, amongst our audience, I wonder how many of them are still doing or have done recently a DINPRO, a PBO, PAI. Or we're so many generations removed now, you know, with web technologies, whether it was Web DINPRO or UI5 now, and even ABAP 00, you know, are people mostly doing ALV grids, but how many people even, you know, of this generation of ABAP developers are doing PBO, PAIs? It might be interesting in the chat. If anybody's done one recently, let us know.
Yeah, that takes me back. You saying PBO and PAI. I mean, that's where that's where I cut my teeth, as it were, when I learned ABAP. Was they threw me right into the deep end and said, "Here, develop this thing," which brings me to another question. I think this is more or less this is a question for everybody, if everybody wants to share. But do you guys remember your first ABAP program you wrote? And if so, what did it do? Anyone?
Tom, what was your first ABAP? I mean, you have been so long around. We already heard DJ with R2, but what was your first ABAP program?
My first ABAP program was, I believe it was like the second day that our project started, and the production planning people came and said, a functional guy came and said, well, we need something to convert planned orders. I said, well, we have a standard transaction for that. I knew that, but they said, yeah, well, it doesn't really do everything we need. We needed to do it like we first of all, we want to bring in all the VC or the variant configuration data and see that on the screen as well, which is what drove the whole thing. So I wrote a program that had a selection screen, and then it did a call screen after the selection screen. And showed, you know, all of these planned orders, and then you could select them in a table control, and you click the little button that says convert, and it would just convert them one at a time. Which, being my first program, I basically had no idea what I was doing. And the first iteration of it ran like crazy slow, because I put one of those SAP GUI status indicator message things on it for every record. So every record, it was sending a message out to the screen, and it would run for like hours. And then I finally figured it out. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's not a good thing to do. So I changed it to only do it every 500 rows or so, and it's sped up really quickly. But that was the first program, I think, that I learned all the ins and outs of what I would be doing for years to come. So it holds a special place in my heart.
I have a funny story about my first. It was actually I went to SAP Education, the intro class. I don't think they were numbered the same way then, to be honest, but like the equivalent of the introduction to ABAP. And it was the first day of the class, and we were learning internal table processing. And I think it was 3.0A, and it was like one of the first classes they offered on the R3.3 release, you know, so it was still pretty rough behind the scenes. But I did, inside my loop at table, I did an append back to the same table that I was looping at. So, of course, it infinitely was adding data to the internal table. And after a minute or two, I crashed the entire system.
Good work.
Now you can't do that. Now there's a limit, an allocation limit check, and it catches that. But at the time, I crashed the host system for everybody in the training course. In fact, I think everybody that was taking different courses in the same facility all were crashed. And I remember the instructor telling me, "Yeah, you're going to be a problem for this course." By the middle of the day on day one, I had already managed to crash the system.
I'm just looking at some of the answers from the folks here in the chat, and there's an amazing range of first programs in everything from who was it that wrote a snake game as their first program, which sounds pretty crazy. Although it does remind me, I did write a virus once in an R2 system, a nice one. But there's also folks done currency conversion. I think it was that Lars that did a currency conversion first. But there's a lot of people said they did stuff relating to ALV, and there's also been quite a few questions about ALV. So maybe that could be something that we think about now. What are your thoughts on ALV, now and future wise as well?
So from my point of view, ALV was a big thing for productivity of the developers. That was one of the really, it couldn't be faster to build a list.
Yeah.
With functionality like sorting, aggregation, downloading the stuff, and so on. We had always the request to make it editable, to allow editing the stuff. That was always a big thing on our list. And whenever we build a new UI technology, Webwin Pro, BSP, or now Fiori, we always need a new ALV, to be honest. If you don't have that, then you fail. That was therefore that's always the first challenge you have if you have a new UI technology which you want to introduce, because everybody knows how easy it was with the ALV, and they don't want to do this now more or less on their own.
Yeah, I can remember.
Oh, go ahead, Rich.
I can remember first discovering ALV. Actually, it was brought to me. Like I said earlier, my first program was DinPro with a table control, and after I was successful with that program, several other programs followed with table control. So I got very used to doing that. And then we had a consultant come in to do some other work, and he showed me his work, and I was like, "What the hell is this?" He's like, "Well, this is ALV." I was like, "This is fantastic." So I actually went back and changed all my table controls to ALVs, and the end users loved it. They were like, "Wow, I can do so much more." And yeah, so and it made the code a lot cleaner. So I was happy to see that stuff.
Yep. Pre-ALV, I think what most customers did is everybody had a template report, right? That where you invested in building all the reusable parts, and you copied it over and over again, and you had 50 copies of that. Maybe you were really good and wrote it as a function module or something, that some reusable parts. But I mean, that's what we did before we had some of these reusable things. And I'm sure thousands of customers around the world all invented the same thing.
There's someone else here talking of learning ABAP and their first programs and stuff. Andrew Fordham said he learned ABAP at a training center in Philadelphia, and was super excited when they found the first ABAP book in a local bookshop. I remember that feeling as well. In fact, I'd said at the time, when I see the first ABAP book in a bookstore, that's where I'm going to retire. I'm finishing SAP, but obviously that didn't happen. But I mean, the range of education possibilities and learning possibilities for SAP in general, but ABAP specifically, has never stopped growing, right?
Absolutely, and I think this is where we also want to grow. If we look a little bit also towards today and towards the future, I think there's still quite a lot of potential to grow this ABAP community. And we had great starts. We had great starts with the SDN Developer Network. I think that was really a very cool story that was started around the NetWeaver times. That was the first time that we really engaged with the developer community out there and sharing knowledge and asking questions and competing about the best way to code and coding styles and what have you. Today, it's still up and running in the sub.com community, and we have also Q&A and a lot of interactions there. But I think this is also something where we believe that there's more potential, that we, especially also with the new technologies that we are building now, that the transition, we are in a very big transition, like from R2 to R3, which was a big transition. We are in even a bigger transition now from on-prem to cloud, or on-prem to hybrid to cloud. And it's so important that community folks all over the planet work together on those challenges. And personally, I've also learned over the last 5 years, we are now doing ABAP in the cloud, or very, very prominently ABAP in the cloud with the Steampunk project. I've never been so much in touch with folks in the community. We have always done tickets and this type of thing. But looking really together at a particular program, running a shared screen session, and then see the code, what they actually execute. I think it comes a little bit back to when SAP started, sitting at the customer. Now, this is not feasible any longer, as we all know, but we can sit together with the customer just doing a shared session. There's also something that we learned in Corona times, that we can move much closer and to do this innovative collaboration together with our customers. I think that we best learn from our customers, no question, and that needs to grow. And I think this should be also something that we bring again to this community idea, that ABAP can grow and can be optimized in discussion together with our adopters.
Yeah, I mean, we only have a couple more minutes left, and I want to give you guys a chance to talk about the future. And so, I mean, we've spent quite a bit of time on the history. So, is there still a need for innovation around ABAP?
I think the main driving force for the innovations in ABAP, and you are right, we are some decades out, so you might have the impression it should be good enough now. It isn't, because if you think about S/4HANA, which is running on ABAP, from this angle, we get a lot of pressure that the ABAP now learns more or less to interact with HANA. You need a new programming model to build these Fiori apps, as you had it before with Dunpro. Now you need a scaling model for Fiori applications. And of course, all the new stuff which we need for the cloud. I'm sorry, but for example, in the cloud, no more SAP modifications are allowed as an example. I know there's a lot of modifications out there. You can't use whatever there is available from SAP. SAP ships all code, you know that, and everything can be used on-premise. This will change. We will go over to public APIs, which is quite common, to be honest, in other languages or other environments. So there are really big changes which we have to introduce in the language and make it as a new standard. And as Karl explained, all that can be already experienced in our Steampunk or the ABAP platform, which we provide in the BTP. So there you see more or less a new phase of ABAP with the ABAP RESTful programming model, with all the new additions which we had in SQL, CDS, our expressions and inline declarations in ABAP and so on. So here we already get a fresh experience how this will look like, all the new tooling and so on. So that from my point of view, and I'm really, I'm part of that community for a long time. It's really a peak concerning investments, which we see currently, just because of we have to feed our S4 developers and the ABAP developers or partners and customers who are using S4, and now we need a new programming model for that.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned a couple of things there around changes for ABAP developers moving forward. Is there any other specific gotchas or changes that ABAP developers are going to face when going to S/4HANA, especially in the cloud, other than what you mentioned?
Yes, so learn SQL, learn the ABAP RESTful programming model. That is, I'm not sure if everybody's already familiar with that. Use the ABAP development tools. Don't stick to SE80. So that's perhaps another thing. And especially for the cloud, the big change, as explained already, is really a clear interface between your code and SAP stuff. because in the cloud we have automated updates, so there are no longer these big upgrade projects running and so on. Therefore, it's an absolute must-have that we have a clear separation. So only clear extension points, only public APIs can be used. That will be the major change from my perspective.
Okay.
I think to add to what you might have been saying there, Boris, somebody's asking about RAP. And again, I think, Karl, you just mentioned programming models. And is the rest, the question was basically, is the RESTful programming model, RESTful ABAP programming model, something also that people should learn?
Yes, definitely. So that's what we always did. And I think that was one of the recipes for successes. What we do internally, we promote externally as well. So how we develop our S/4HANA application, that's the way how the S/4HANA application shall be extended by customers. So we internally at SAP use the RESTful ABAP programming model to build the Fiori applications. And then you can be sure if thousands of SAP developers are using it day by day, then it's good enough for partners and for extensions of customers as well. And that's exactly happening today, that the mass of the S4 developers are using that programming model to build their applications.
You mentioned something about the use of ADT earlier. I want to loop back on that. So as ABAP developers, we have, and hopefully I don't get smacked by a bunch of ABAP guys over in Waldorf for this, but we have SE80 and SAP GUI, and we have ADT based on Eclipse for our IDEs. Okay, is there any plans to support a web-based ABAP development IDE similar to the SAP Business Application Studio in the future?
To be honest, I can't remember a session where I haven't received that question.
All right,
and I always, therefore, and to be sorry, I'm really sorry, but I always provide the same answer. And the answer is that we invest continuously in ADT and make it better and better and ensure that development efficiency is good there. That's really the leading part. We want to increase the efficiency and therefore invest here and don't want more or less to disrupt ourselves with now investing in another IDE. And we always get then the argument, okay, it would be nice to develop the UI and the backend part in one IDE and both in the Fiori tools as an example. But even the screen painter was somehow separated, let's say it like that. And we invest, I think it's better to invest in the integration points where it really pays off. So we invest, for example, in Preview, where you can, in the backend, directly see after do changes in CDS, how this will look like in the UI, or navigation between both IDEs, lifecycle management integration, or, and perhaps that's for our developers, the best part, think about selection screen. There was no UI development necessary at all. So we try to find out for standard screens if you can get rid of the complete UI development part, if it's a standard screen, and then all this happens more or less in the backend. So these are more the points where we invest to increase development efficiency and don't try to always get to the next IDE, but invest continuously in the IDE which we have currently. Perhaps one last sentence, of course, from us, let's say strategy and from an architecture side, we try to service enable and to create APIs for all the repository and IDE stuff. So for create class whatsoever. So that wherever it is necessary that there's an integration with the web IDE, or if we want to switch the IDE in the future, we are well prepared concerning our backend so that we then can have the APIs already on hand. Yeah, sorry, no other answer available.
That's okay. I do have a couple other questions on the list here, but I don't think we have time for those. But there is one last question here that I have. So for me, and I'm sure the others here have seen this as well. Basically, every time I mention ABAP, whether it's on LinkedIn or Twitter, I always get someone coming back to me saying something to the effect of ABAP is obsolete or ABAP is dead or something around those lines, right? And then back in the NetWeaver days, there was a lot of chatter around Java replacing ABAP. Of course, we know that never happened. But here and now, I'd love to give you guys the opportunity to kind of squash all the leftover rumors that are out there about, the longevity of ABAP, and maybe tell us a little bit about how SAP continues to invest in ABAP for the long term.
Maybe I start on that one, and Boris, please add in wherever needed. But I think, yes, absolutely, there is competition inside the company. There is competition from many different angles. And NetWeaver is a very good example. So we had a very dynamic chief technology officer at that time, and he pushed Java. That's for sure. So there was competition, and you remember the WebTumbro times where the initial implementation was Java based, and everybody thought, okay, now ABAP is basically this backend machinery. This is basically stored procedures, if you will, on the ABAP stack, and everything which is cool is running on a different level. But likewise, we have many different, the Visual Basic thing that was when OLE, object linking and embedding, came into the game. And I think ABAP proved, although there are a couple of old-fashioned things inside ABAP proved to be a very dynamic environment that always found ways to incorporate those demands on the first hand. ABAP itself was also started as basically a submarine project, I would say. In the initial days, there was basically no time to develop an interpreter because the system was needed for doing application development, and the founders basically of the ABAP idea, they did it at the weekend. They only could continue with their work in the weekend. But coming back to the question, I think there's always competition. There's new ideas out there, and certainly this has an influence that gives us pressure. We need to understand, we need to react. I think HANA, as an important example, pushed us to create something like core data services 5 or 6 years ago. And we were able to incorporate it into the ABAP environment very seamlessly. And now we are very proud of what we have achieved. And it's really a driving force of all of our adoption, etc. So this way, ABAP always needs to reinvent itself. It cannot stay with this brochure 30 years ago. That's not sufficient. It needs to leave behind a little bit the heritage and then go to new boundaries, keeping some of the really essential stuff, but look out what's happening. And the second thing, and then I hand over to Boris, is ABAP always interfaces with these many artifacts, with the Fiori. Or for example, just recently we introduced analytics integration for Steampunk so that you can combine analytical dashboards from SAP Analytics Cloud very seamlessly. We are about to open to release an ODBC driver for ABAP so that you can even take your Excel and connect back to a Steampunk system. So in that sense, ABAP needs to be open, needs to be flexible. And if that would stop, ABAP would stop. But we are very keen on continuing with that path. Over to you, Boris.
Yes, I think you covered that already perfectly. So to be honest, I'm not scared. Not at all. So
Good.
seeing all the stuff which we have on our plate for the next years, what we have to add to the language, to the tools and all this stuff, just because there is the pressure from the applications and from the customers and partners. It's really a very good time in the ABAP platform, to be very, very honest. So I'm not scared, and seeing the big community we have out there, the customers, which products are running on the ABAP platform, it's really nice. I can't say it in other words, but it's good that there's competition. It would be really bad if we would have only ABAP. That would be really bad. Therefore, competition is nice. Everybody has the choice. That's good as well. We see that in the BTP where we have Java, Node, and ABAP, and customers have the choice what they choose. But there's always a good niche for each of those offerings, and the customer can choose.
Perfect. Listen, I can't believe I'm saying this, but we're already at an hour. It feels as though it went, like 5 minutes. And thank you so much to everyone in the chat. First of all, I'm really sorry I didn't get to many of the questions. There were so many questions, so many positive comments. ABAP's not dead. I saw that from Uwe, for example, a classic. Maybe we do need to do this again. There's been some chat as to, maybe we have another one of these. I'm looking at you, Boris and Karl, if you might want to come on again sometime in the future. We don't know when. But I've really enjoyed listening to everything that's been said, and also seeing all the amazing chat here. So I'm going to have to wrap this up. We hit the top of the hour. Thanks everybody so much for taking part in the chat and being so interactive. But really super thanks to Boris and Karl, and of course to Tom and Rich for doing this. Yeah, maybe we can do this again soon. So until next time, ABAP's not dead.
Thanks, DJ. Thanks, folks.
Thanks.
Take care, folks.